Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a self-defeating supercomputer trapped in the body of a sublime yet subdued autumnal earth goddess, here to talk to you today about Sun in Virgo. And as I am a Sun in Virgo myself, I am hoping that I will be able to effectively communicate to you what it is like to be a Virgo on an existential and experiential level. Now, I think when we are looking at the elemental attributes of every sign, we can sometimes be a bit too single-minded. You know, we can neatly divide the 12 signs of the wheel of the horoscope into the 4 elements with free belonging to each element. But when we're looking at the mutable signs, what we are really seeing is a being in transition, a being in flux, a chimera, a hybrid, like some of the weird monsters that you find in medieval bestiaries. You are seeing something that was one thing and is in the process of transforming into another. And in the case of Virgo, what you really have is an air sign trapped in an earthy body. Virgo is ruled by Mercury, probably the airiest of the planets after Uranus, but compelled to work within the dictates, limitations, and restraints of the earth. And this uneasy matching of the airy, the abstract, and the intellectual with the practical and necessary is, for me, a big part of some of the nervous uneasiness of the Virgo sign. So Virgo is an earth sign that doesn't really want to be an earth sign, but which gradually, over its lifespan, has to find a way of reconciling itself with its fate and finding a way of unifying the complex opposites that exist within it. The fact that it has this mind that truly belongs to the heavens, and yet this body which belongs to the earth, and finding a way of making them both work together as a synthesized unit rather than as two forces that are disparate, divided, and not capable of working with one another. And I think when you watch Virgos developing and growing up, you often see that it takes a long time before this alchemical process of unification can take place. That some Virgos growing up identify wholly with their mind and their mercurial side. These are beings who live in a world of pure intellect and ideation. Mercury was the messenger of the gods of the Olympic pantheon. He had complete freedom of movement between all the worlds, and he was impossible to tie down. In all the Greek myths that I am aware of, there is never a point at which Mercury ever gets into any kind of tight spot that he isn't immediately able to unravel and get himself out of. Again, so he represents the fact that the mind, left to its own devices, detached from the prison cage that is the body, is boundless, is limitless, is infinite and expansive. It has no real end to it, just like outer space. But it also has a certain immaculate perfection to it. When we look at the higher order of ideas and symbols and archetypes, we can see that there is this overarching structure and perfection and cosmic order to it, which the manifest external world lacks. If we think about the realms of logic and mathematics and even astrology, we can imagine these systems in which everything interlocks and connects together perfectly as some kind of celestial, magnified whole, where nothing is aberrant, nothing is ever out of place. All those loose ends are perfectly tied together for some ultimate functionality that is ultimately beyond our comprehension. That is the world of pure thought. But Mercury in Virgo is having to reconcile with the fact that it has this awareness of the infinities of the intellect, but somehow must constrain them to the limitations of having a physical body, which has needs and desires and wants and difficulties that must be attended to, that the mind is not separate to the body but engaged with the body, and somehow we have to find a way of living with them because we are psychosomatic beings. Our mind impacts our body and our body impacts our mind. So really, a Virgo, even though it's symbolized by a single being, unlike Gemini, is just as dualized in its nature. However, the difference with Virgo is that I think its ultimate quest is one of alchemy, is one of finding a way of overcoming that duality and becoming a singularity, so that like a true Virgo, it can be sufficient unto itself. When we are looking at the symbology of a virginal woman to represent Virgo, we can look at it on several different levels. In the ancient world, Virgo didn't necessarily refer to whether someone was sexually awakened or experienced or not. It rather denoted a woman who was free and independent, who was not possessed of by a husband or the slave to someone else, but who was, in a sense, her own woman. She wasn't someone else's possession or chattel or belongings. And this expresses the fact that Virgoan people do have a strongly independent nature. It might not be as obviously fiery or flamboyant as, say, the independence expressed by a Leo or an Aries. Rather, it is this quiet, brooding conscientiousness of wanting to maintain a purity of self. Where the sun is in the zodiac always depicts how we go about the process of individuation. Whilst Mercury by himself has limitless horizons, the Earth has strong boundaries and feels protected and safe by having those boundaries. Virgo Sun wants to be itself and no one else. It doesn't want to be contaminated by the influence of other people that could make it too passive and receptive. Virgo is trying not to be Pisces, which on the other end of the zodiac has no boundaries, but has the virtue, therefore, of being receptive and open to everything, and thereby becoming everything and nothing at the same time. But Virgo, trying to reconcile itself with its earthiness and its airiness, with its grand intellect, which it ultimately has to find a way of applying to some kind of practical worldly usage, is afraid of being stuck in that cosmic ocean of Pisces, because then that would clog up its ability to think logically and rationally and clearly, and its ability to function in accordance with the dictates of its mind and body. So it wants to have strong, clear boundaries of who it is. And this, to me, is why so many Virgo people end up having a strong need for solitude. Even if there's other factors in the chart that make them very social or relationship-oriented people, many Virgos go through a period in their life or have the regular need to withdraw from the world, to have a place that is their own private witch cottage, which is their own private palace of incubation where they can hermit and cut off from the pollution of the world and return to the purified self-knowledge of what it is to be them and to be them alone. To know that their survival and reality and self-becoming depends upon the seeds that they have planted within themselves, which the heaven perhaps, which Mercury itself has planted within themselves, and no one else. So if we think about the fact that the Blessed Virgin Mary became a deity during the age of Pisces that preceded the current age of Aquarius, if Pisces was the rising sign, then Virgo was the descending sign. It represented the necessary opposite, which symbolically the Blessed Virgin Mary fulfilled. And she is a good symbol for this mercurial marriage within a Virgo, in that she was ostensibly an ordinary, earthy, sexually inexperienced woman who somehow became the vessel for the Godhead. She became a womb for the divine. And I think every Virgo feels that innate divinity lurking within their apparent ordinariness and earthiness. And they want to find a way of hatching that and fulfilling that and being the midwife of that unique teleology and essence. And they have to do it by themselves. Behind some of the meekness and the humility that Virgos can sometimes present and use as a mask, there is that ferocious pride and independence that has to find a way of being themselves and serving the world, but on their own terms. So both Virgo and Pisces have this need to serve and to give to the world. But whereas Pisces, like the image of Jesus in the Christian religion that was dominant in the age of Pisces, felt the need to sacrifice and surrender the total self, Virgo wants to find a way of giving to the world and serving the world, of using its divine intellectual gifts to help improve the world and make a better place, whilst still being itself. It wants to give without losing itself. And that battle within is the life's work of the Virgo. So if we think of that divine intellect that Virgos can be blessed with, assuming there's nothing in their chart that is horribly afflicting their Mercuries or their third houses, being born with that awareness that you can see more clearly and deeply than other people, that you have an ability to order and arrange and reshuffle the cosmos in your mind that other people lack, that you have a greater critical function than other people, you feel a need not to waste that. You realize that your gifts are unique and special in some way, and that you need to find some kind of earthy, practical outlet for using those gifts so that you don't feel that your life is wasted. And this is perhaps another divide between Gemini and Virgo. Mercury in Gemini has that hunger and thirst for ideas. It's very curious. It needs to be intellectually interested and stimulated, but it doesn't necessarily always need to find a practical outlet for those interests. It's sufficient for it to find a world of ideas that can keep it moving and flowing. With Virgo, the ideas and the mind have to produce practical, solid, real-world results in order for them to feel satisfied. They have to be able to give birth to and be a midwife for their ideas in a concrete, visible way that other people can see, appreciate, and be benefited by. Part of the horror of being a Virgo, the fact that produces so much agony and inattention, and the tendency to overthink and worry oneself into a stomach ulcer, is the fact that that higher mercurial mind can imagine perfection, but then has to reconcile itself to living in an earthly realm in which perfection is impossible, where compromises have to be made, where out of the infinitude of things we could possibly do to make the world a better place, we may have to be satisfied with only improving and offering our services to a very small part of it. So it's taking that big, divine, heavenly conception of things and then humbling it and humiliating it by saying, actually, I'm a physical being with a finite amount of time alive, with a finite amount of energy, and as much as I might feel driven to improve the energy levels and the efficacy of my mind-body continuum by looking after both my physical and psychological health, even with the most perfected of bodies, even with the best dietary requirements and exercise routines and vitamin supplements, I am still a human being that needs to rest and which needs to sleep and which can work itself to death, that has a period, that has a stop at some point. I can't do everything. I can't be necessarily the big mover shaker like a revolutionary Aquarian or Scorpio might try to be, but I can improve a little patch of the world around me. I can find little ways of bringing the divine into the world that are within my capability. And this lesson can be hardly won for a lot of Virgos. I think when Virgos are growing up, there are some who side more with the earthy side of Virgo, and there are those who side more with the intellectual side. But over time, both of these parties will realize the necessity of finding a way of wedding the two, otherwise life will not function well for them. Because those who just commit solely to that intellectual function and become very idealistic and very imaginative and have that constant striving after noble ideals, I think eventually think themselves into a cul-de-sac. They have that moment where they realize that as infinite as their ideas are, their practical abilities aren't, because Virgo is related to the cultivation of skills. The fact that you can have the mind of a genius composer, but unless you can learn the practical abilities to convey that genius through the actual writing of music that other people can hear, or through the mastery of skills of a specific instrument, those ideas will be forever lost. So out of the infinitude of things you could do, you have to play triage and think, what is it best for me to do with this mind? What practical outlet do I need to find to make this mind feel satisfied, knowing that I cannot do everything, but there's a good chance that I'm going to try. So this kind of Virgo, I think, in the early part of its life, can be easily inclined to spread itself too thin. It wants to find a way of mastering every skill, to master every field of knowledge. It wants to have a mind that is as complete and total as a well-stocked library, but also to have practical skills that render it self-sufficient so that it never has to ask anyone else for help. Again, this is part of that idea of a Virgo being purified and self-fulfilling and self-seeding in a way. If we think about physical virginity, the hymen, the protective membrane, has not been penetrated yet. It is keeping the energy centers of that person self-contained. And I think sometimes just having the vulnerability and the humility to go to someone else and to ask them for help can feel almost like a penetration, almost like a violation, almost like too great a humbling of that inner divine nature, which needs to find a way of fulfilling itself. But anyway, if this Virgo does spread itself too thin, if it tries to master too many psychological and earthly skills at once, it eventually reaches this point where it finds that its attempt to be this universal juggler who knows everything and can do everything is either sometimes making it the jack of all trades and the master of none, although actually it can master quite a few of those, or is putting such a strain on its physical being that it ends up having a nervous breakdown. And because if it identifies too much with the mind doesn't have any boundaries. It doesn't see any reason why it couldn't potentially infinitely know everything. When it has that breakdown and it realizes that the efficiency of its mind is dependent on the welfare of its body, and that the body cannot just be worked to death like a supercomputer that never needs its batteries changed or recharged, then it has to humble its ideas and aspirations. It has to realize that it can't be this mercurial puer aeternus, that it has to reconcile itself with the fact that even though it has a divine seed, it is still mortal and has to live within the same mortal constraints of other beings. And this difficulty isn't necessarily experienced solely by Virgo alone as an existential phenomenon. It can also be true of people with strong Uranus placements, particularly when Uranus is in an earthy house. But that idea of seeing the infinite and the divine and having to make it finite and mortal is part of the Virgoan process. You know, Virgo is the goddess of the harvest, where the wheat and the chaff must be separated, where we throw away the dross that we can't use and we focus on that we can. And this is where Virgo has to use its critical capacities to look at the multitude of things it could do and say, okay, I'm just going to stick with these ones. This is what my life's mission will be, and I will probably get a lot more done if I focus all of my intellectual and practical ability on just these few things rather than trying to do everything. And that doesn't mean they won't find ways of cramming things in between, because that restless desire for new knowledge and new skills will always be there, especially in accordance with their awareness of the changing needs of the times. But especially after the Saturn return, there is that need to humble one's aspirations and to work within the confinement of the self and to take pride in that confinement as a specialist or an expert of some kind. I think the other way that a Virgo has to come to terms with earthiness is coming to terms with imperfection. That heightened, pristine mind can always envisage things at their highest level of efficiency and perfection. And if it lives too much in its mind, then the real world is always going to seem base and ugly and nightmarish and distorted in comparison with the perfection they can envisage in their mind. You know, the critical function of the Virgoan mind is there to help them improve and better and refine the things that are existing in the world, to look at something and say, okay, you know, that has some positive attributes here and there, but if these things here and there were tweaked, it could be improved, it could be made to work and function better. It could be that little bit closer to the divine. But if a Virgo stays too solidly trapped in its intellect and cannot turn off this critical function or reconcile itself to the imperfections of the earth, then it can easily make itself miserable, because whatever it sees, no matter how good, beautiful or wonderful or divine in and of itself, is always going to come short of the Platonic realm that it can see in its mind. These can be the Virgos who never have anything good to say about anything, because no matter how beautiful or pristine something is, it can always see the wrinkles, it can always see the weak spots, it can always see those things that, given a second rendition, could be better. But part of being earthy and practical and living in the real world is accepting that for something to work, for something to survive, for something to thrive, it doesn't always have to be it doesn't have to always to be perfect. Sometimes it just has to be good enough to achieve its function and nothing more. Because being earthy, being this harvest goddess, it wants to be prolific, it wants to be productive, it wants to produce real world results out there in the world. It wants its body and mind to be able to reap a good harvest of intellectual and practical accomplishments. But that critical mind can be a harsh scythe which chops everything down, which says that, okay, I'm separating the wheat from the chaff, but because my filter is on so strong and so negatively attuned to the worst possible outcomes of everything, it sees everything as chaff. Nothing is wheat, everything is just dross that should be better. So learning to let go of the need to control and perfect everything, ironically, is one of those things that a Virgo can do to be more effective, to be more productive, because then it can just work and get things out there and accept that once something is up to a certain standard, then we need to give birth to it. We need to be that midwife. We need to let it go. We can't afford to be too precious and hold our divine seed within us forever for fear of having it corrupted by the world out there. Like a true single mother, we have to do the best at raising and nurturing our ideas, but then we have to release them and let them take care of themselves so that we can get started on the next thing. Anyway, speaking of getting started on the next thing, rather than make this video too long, I'm going to stop it there. I've been finding it very hard to make videos lately, which, with both Venus and Mercury retrograde, I think you can appreciate why, for those of you in the astrological community. So I just wanted to make a video for the sake of making a video, really, to show that I can still produce a harvest of some kind. There are many transits lately that I've missed out on. I'm hoping to catch up, but I can also see that with, I think this being the 100th video I've made since I started making videos back in November, I am not able to keep up the same prolific pace as before. My mind does need a bit of time to rejuvenate, regenerate, and reinvent itself. So thank you for your patience and for bearing with me during this personal time of transition and transformation. Anyway, please share your own stories and narratives and ideas in the comment section about those of you with Virgo and placements. I'd love to hear from you about your experience of matching those heavenly and earthly energies within yourself and being reconciled to the necessities and needs of both of them. If you want to contact me more personally, you can email me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on Instagram at astrologyandunderwear, and yeah, you can also do whatever the hell you like as well. The world is open to you. Run for those wheat fields.